The hospital room was a vacuum of sterile silence, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the oxygen monitor and the distant, lonely squeak of a nurse's cart in the hallway. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, the dead hour. This is the time when the world feels fragile, when the veil between being and non-being is at its thinnest. I lay there, trapped in a haze of post-surgical fog, my body feeling like a jigsaw puzzle that had been put back together by someone in a violent hurry. The car crash was a blur of screeching metal and shattered glass, but the aftermath was a cold, hard reality. I had 2 shattered ribs, a punctured lung, and a titanium plate in my left leg. I was drifting in and out of a morphine-induced sleep when my phone, resting on the cold Formica bedside table, vibrated. The sound felt like a jackhammer against my skull. It was a voice note from my mother, Jennifer. I pressed play, expecting a frantic check-in. Instead, I heard the crisp, unmistakable pop of a champagne cork, followed by the muffled hum of jet engines. "Maya. Honey," my mother's voice crackled. "We've decided it's best if we go ahead with the trip. Brianna really needs this Italy break to find her creative spark after that boutique mess. You're in good hands with the nurses, they're professionals, and honestly, we'd just be in the way here. Do not disturb our fun by calling with recovery updates. We really need to unplug. We'll check on you when we land in Rome. Ciao." "Darling." In the background, I heard my sister Brianna's high-pitched giggle. "Finally," she whispered. "Actual luxury." I watched the red light of the heart monitor blink. I didn't let my pulse move a single beat. I didn't waste a breath on a plea. I simply felt the structural integrity of our relationship give way. The family I had built was a condemned building, and I was finally stepping outside. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. In the world of high-end structural design, we don't just talk about the beauty of a facade. We talk about the yield point. This is the specific, quantifiable moment when a material, whether it's reinforced concrete or tempered steel, is stretched so far beyond its capacity that the molecular bonds begin to snap. Once a structure hits its yield point, it can never return to its original shape. It is permanently deformed, a hollow shell of its former strength, waiting for the inevitable collapse. As I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the sterile, perforated tiles of the ceiling, I realized I had reached my yield point long before the car crash ever happened. The drunk driver who slammed into my driver's side door was merely the external force that exposed the internal rot of my life. For over a decade, I had been the central load-bearing column for my entire family. I was the reliable one, a title that sounds like a compliment but functions like a life sentence. I thought about the boutiques. My sister Brianna, 32 years old and still convinced she was a star in waiting, had cycled through 3 failed business ventures in 4 years. She called her latest obsession a $60,000 hole in my savings, a curated lifestyle experience. I remembered her standing in my kitchen, draped in silk I had paid for, sipping an organic latte from a machine I had bought, and telling me with a straight face that I wouldn't understand the creative soul because I just drew boxes for a living. I drew the boxes that paid her downtown rent. I drew the boxes that kept the lights on in the luxury apartment she used as a backdrop for her failing Instagram brand. Then there was my father, Thomas. He was a man who viewed my success as his personal retirement fund. Whenever his tech startup investments, which were usually just high-stakes gambling rings disguised as opportunities, went south, he didn't call to ask for a loan. He called to demand his dividend. My mother, Jennifer, was the emotional architect of this exploitation. She was the one who whispered about family duty and blood loyalty whenever I tried to set a boundary. She mastered the art of making me feel guilty for my own hard work, suggesting that since I was the fortunate one, I had a moral obligation to subsidize the laziness and incompetence of everyone else. I realized then, with the cold clarity that only comes when you are stripped of your utility, that they didn't see a daughter or a sister in this bed. They saw a broken machine. They saw an ATM that had suddenly displayed an out-of-service sign, ruining their scheduled fun. To them, my trauma was an inconvenience, a downward vibe that threatened their first-class itinerary to Rome. They didn't stay to comfort me, because you don't stay to comfort a tool. You just wait for it to be repaired so you can put it back to work. This is the hidden cost of being the strong one. People stop seeing your humanity and start seeing your output. I was a structural element, and like a steel beam, they assumed I had no feelings, no exhaustion, and no limit. But every material has a limit. As the mechanical hiss of the oxygen monitor filled the room, I made a silent vow. If I was just a machine to them, then it was time for this machine to execute a full system shutdown. The foundation was tired of holding up the weight of people who wouldn't even hold my hand while I bled. In my profession, we don't just build, we deconstruct. Before a single new beam can be hoisted into the sky, the old, decaying structure must be cleared. We call it site preparation, but in reality, it is the art of controlled demolition. You have to find the primary supports, the points where the weight is concentrated, and sever them with surgical precision. If you do it correctly, the entire building collapses inward, leaving the surrounding neighborhood untouched. As I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the digital glow of my smartphone, I realized I was no longer an architect of skyscrapers. I was the demolition expert of my own life. My anger wasn't a roar, it was a blueprint. It was a cold, calculated plan drafted in the silence of a recovery ward. My family believed they were currently soaring toward a Tuscan sunset at 30,000 feet, fueled by my years of silent labor and reliable contributions. They were thousands of miles away, trapped in a pressurized metal tube over the Atlantic, completely unaware that the ground they intended to land on had already been removed. I viewed the situation with the same analytical detachment I used when assessing a faulty foundation. They had asked me not to disturb their peace. I was about to give them more peace than they ever bargained for. Using my left hand, the one not restricted by an IV line and the heavy gauze of surgery, I accessed my primary banking portal. The light of the screen was blinding in the dim hospital room, reflecting off the chrome rails of my bed like a digital blade. My thumb moved with a mechanical, rhythmic efficiency. I didn't pause for a second of doubt. I didn't wait for a surge of guilt to stop me. This wasn't an emotional crisis. It was a long overdue system purge. I navigated to the Authorized Users tab of my accounts. As a senior architect, my annual earnings exceeded $200,000, a fortune I had never truly enjoyed because it was constantly being siphoned off to pay for Brianna's boutique overhead or my father's investment recoveries. For 3 years, I had been the invisible foundation supporting their lavish lifestyle. I saw their names listed there, 3 digital leeches attached to my life's work: Jennifer, Thomas, and Brianna. With 3 deliberate taps, I selected their profiles. I clicked Deactivate User. In 45 seconds, their unlimited luxury vanished. The credit lines that were currently paying for their first-class mimosas and high-speed Wi-Fi simply ceased to exist. But a true demolition requires more than just cutting the power. You have to remove the shelter. I opened my confirmation for the $18,500 villa I had secured in the hills of Tuscany, a sprawling estate with a private vineyard and a chef I had prepaid to welcome them. I clicked Cancel Booking. The system flashed a warning. Late cancellation will result in a $9,000 penalty. I accepted the loss without a blink. That money was a small price to pay for the silence I was about to buy. I proceeded to message the private car service in Rome, canceling the Mercedes Sprinter scheduled for their arrival. I revoked the prepaid private tours of the Vatican and the wine-tasting excursions in Chianti. Finally, I canceled the reservations at every high-end restaurant where my father intended to drink $500 bottles of wine on my dime. I leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows, watching the canceled alerts populate my screen like falling dominoes. My family was currently enjoying the height of hospitality, unaware that they were about to land as penniless strangers in a city that doesn't offer credit to the entitled. They had requested that I not disturb their peace. I was merely ensuring that by the time they touched down, they would have nothing but their own company to keep them occupied. The foundation was gone. The site was clear. Now, I could finally begin to build something for myself. There is a specific kind of poison that seeps into the life of the reliable child, and it's a toxin that builds up over decades until it finally paralyzes the heart. In psychology, they might call it parentification or codependency, but in the raw, cold reality of my family, I called it the trap of conditioned worth. From the time I was 10 years old, I was taught not through words, but through the heavy, expectant silences of my parents, that my value was directly proportional to my utility. I wasn't loved for the fact that I existed. I was appreciated for the functions I performed. I remember being 12 and staying up until midnight to help my mother, Jennifer, organize the neighborhood charity gala because she had lost track of time. I didn't get a thank you. I got a pat on the head and a comment about how lucky she was to have a daughter who was so much more competent than her flighty younger sister, Brianna. That was the hook. They used my competence as a cage. By labeling me the strong one, the smart one, and the successful one, they effectively gave themselves permission to never be any of those things. They turned my virtues into a permanent service contract. For years, I believed that if I just worked a little harder, earned a little more, and fixed a few more of their disasters, I would finally earn the right to be seen as a human being. I thought that if I paid for the boutique, or covered the mortgage when Dad had a bad month, I was buying my way into their hearts. But as I lay in that hospital bed, the sterile white lights exposing every lie I'd told myself, I realized the terrifying truth. You cannot buy a place in a heart that only sees you as a resource. To them, I wasn't a daughter in pain. I was an asset that had suddenly stopped yielding a return. This is the cruelty of the reliable child archetype. When you are the one who always has the answer, the one who always pays the bill, and the one who always survives the storm, people stop asking if you're cold. They stop wondering if you're tired. They treat your endurance as a natural resource, like air or water, something that is simply there, inexhaustible and free for the taking. My mother's voice note from the plane was the ultimate confirmation of this. Her "do not disturb our fun" wasn't just a request for quiet. It was a statement of my status. I was the help, and the help isn't supposed to interrupt the master's vacation with news of its own broken bones. The trap of conditioned worth is a prison where the bars are made of your own accomplishments. Every promotion I earned at the architectural firm didn't mean more freedom for me. It just meant a higher credit limit for Brianna and a more expensive wine cellar for Thomas. They had spent years conditioning me to believe that my only purpose was to be the foundation upon which they built their frivolous lives. But as the morphine haze lifted and the raw, jagged pain of my shattered ribs took its place, I felt a new kind of strength. It wasn't the strength of a load-bearing pillar. It was the strength of a wildfire. If my worth was only conditional on what I provided, then by providing nothing, I was finally reclaiming my soul. I was ready to let their world collapse, just to see what my life looked like without the weight of them on my shoulders. The do not disturb silence on my phone lasted exactly 11 hours and 42 minutes, the precise duration of a non-stop flight from Chicago O'Hare to Leonardo da Vinci Airport, plus the 30 minutes it takes to clear customs and realize your world has functionally ended at a taxi stand. In the world of architecture, we call this a catastrophic phase shift. One moment, a structure is standing, bathed in the golden light of sunset. The next, the load-bearing supports are gone, and gravity takes over with relentless, unblinking physics. At 1:15 in the afternoon, local Chicago time, I reached over with my good hand and toggled the small switch on the side of my phone. I didn't even have time to set the device back down on the Formica table before it began to shriek. It wasn't just a vibration, it was a digital landslide, a desperate, frantic pulse that felt like the device was having a seizure in my palm. The screen was a blur of notifications, 38 missed calls, 56 text messages, and 7 voicemails that had piled up like debris after a flood. I opened the texts from my sister, Brianna, first. Her descent from casual arrogance to jagged hysteria was a masterclass in the psychology of entitlement. 10 o'clock and 5 minutes a.m. Maya, the card declined at the airport espresso bar. Fix it now. It's embarrassing. 10 o'clock and 30 minutes a.m. The private car isn't here. We're standing in the heat, like paupers. Check the app. Dad is furious. 11 o'clock and 15 minutes a.m. Maya. Every single card is declining, even the emergency one. What did you do? We're stuck on a sidewalk with 12 suitcases. You are literally ruining my mental health. Call us this second. Then came the voice note from my mother. Jennifer. I pressed play, and the sterile air of the hospital room was suddenly filled with her shrill, high-frequency panic. The champagne-dazed cheer from her previous message was gone, replaced by a tone so sharp it could have cut glass. Maya Elizabeth, I don't know what kind of sick, dramatic game you are playing because you're upset about the trip, but this is disgusting. We are your parents. You have us stranded in a foreign country with no way to get to a hotel. Your father tried his emergency backup, and it's blocked too. You fix this in the next 5 minutes, or don't bother calling us family ever again. Do you hear me? Dead to us. I listened to the entire message twice. My pulse remained a flat line of architectural indifference. I didn't feel the need to explain that I was currently recovering from major surgery. In my professional life, when a contractor ignores a blueprint and the roof sags, you don't argue with the rain. You fix the design. My family had ignored the blueprint of basic human decency for decades, and now the rain was pouring in. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for too long, and the account was finally, permanently closed. I didn't reply to their messages. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a fight or the comfort of an explanation. To do so would be to acknowledge that they still had a seat at the table of my life. Instead, I made one outgoing call to my attorney and longtime friend, Sarah. Her voice was the only thing I wanted to hear, steady, logical, and anchored in reality. Sarah, I said, my voice sounding like ground stone. I'm in the hospital. I've already revoked their financial access. But I need you to go deeper. I need a full, forensic audit of the medical trust fund I set up for my parents. I noticed a discrepancy in the quarterly reports before the crash, and I have a feeling the rot goes deeper than the surface. I'm not just cutting the cord, Sarah. I'm performing a full structural investigation. As I hung up, I realized the silence on the other end of the Atlantic was the most expensive thing I had ever bought, and it was worth every penny. In the world of architectural forensics, we are trained to look for hairline fractures. To the untrained eye, a tiny crack in a concrete foundation doesn't look like much, it's just a thin, jagged line in the gray expanse. But to an architect, that line tells a story of structural betrayal. It indicates that the soil has shifted, the rebar has failed, or the load was never what we were told it would be. While my family was busy screaming at hostel clerks in Rome and frantically refreshing their banking apps in the humid Italian heat, my attorney, Sarah, was finding the hairline fractures in my life. She called me 2 days later. I was sitting up for the first time without a nurse's assistance, the midday sun streaming through the hospital blinds, casting long, cage-like shadows across my lap. Sarah's voice didn't have its usual professional warmth or its dry, legal wit. It was flat, cold. It was the voice of a woman who had seen something that offended her fundamental sense of order. Maya, she said, skipping the pleasantries. The forensic audit is done. I've gone through the medical trust fund you set up last year, and I need you to understand that this isn't just a case of overspending. It's a case of systematic extraction. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Tell me everything, Sarah. Don't leave out a single detail. The fund you established for your mother's potential medical needs, the one you seeded with $50,000 of your own bonuses, it's been hemorrhaging cash for 18 months, Sarah explained. But it's the authorization that's the real problem. There are 12 separate drawdown requests, all carrying your digital signature, authorizing high-interest loans against your future architectural commissions. They weren't just spending what you gave them, Maya. They were borrowing against money you haven't even earned yet, totaling over $40,000. I leaned my head back against the thin pillow, the room spinning slightly. I never signed those, Sarah. I haven't looked at that fund's portal in months. I trusted them. I know, Sarah said, her voice softening just a fraction. I've already run the metadata on the signatures. The timestamps match the periods when you were on site in Dubai or locked in the drafting room for the Peterson project. The IP addresses for every single one of those digital signatures trace back to your father's home office. Thomas didn't just spend your money, Maya. He used his knowledge of your business affairs to forge your identity. He stole your future to fund Brianna's credit card debts, and this celebratory trip to Italy, they weren't just taking a vacation on your dime. They were throwing a party with the money they stole from your pocket while you were unconscious in a hospital bed. This was the terminal crack. The revelation was like a wrecking ball hitting the center of my chest. My father hadn't just been a bad investor or a man with bad luck. He had been a predator in a polo shirt. He had been waiting for me to be too busy building skyscrapers to notice he was digging a tunnel under my feet. My mother had likely known. Her silence bought with the designer handbags and first-class upgrades. They had looked me in the eye for a year and a half, knowing they were dismantling my financial security while I worked 80-hour weeks to keep them comfortable. "I want the records, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "I want the IP logs, the forged documents, and the bank transcripts. All of it. Bind it into a single file. Because when they get back, I'm not just going to set a boundary. I'm going to file a demolition order on this family that no amount of blood loyalty can repair." I realized then that my father had made a fatal error. He forgot that the person who builds the house knows exactly where to place the explosives to bring it down. The process of healing is rarely linear. It is a slow, grinding reconstruction of the self, much like the restoration of a historic building that has suffered severe fire damage. You have to scrape away the soot, replace the charred timbers, and ensure the new foundation is poured with a higher grade of concrete. By the time I was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks later, I was no longer the woman who had been pulled from that wreckage. I walked with a cane, my ribs were bound in a tight compression wrap, and my gait was measured, but my mind was as sharp as a diamond-tipped saw. I was sitting at my mahogany dining table, a piece of furniture I had designed myself when the front door to my apartment burst open. They didn't knock, they didn't call, they still operated under the delusion that they owned the keys to my life. Jennifer, Thomas, and Brianna marched in, looking like a parody of their former selves. The actual luxury they had craved had been replaced by a haggard, sunburnt desperation. They were dressed in cheap, wrinkled clothes they'd clearly bought at a Roman street market after their designer luggage was held hostage by a hotel they couldn't pay for. "You!" Jennifer shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "Do you have any idea what you put us through? We spent 10 days in a dormitory with 12 strangers. We had to eat bread and street fruit. Your sister has lost 5 pounds from the sheer psychological stress of being stranded in a foreign city." Brianna flopped onto my designer sofa, the one she'd always envied, and began to sob, a practiced, theatrical sound. "You're a monster, Maya. You could have killed us. We're family. Blood is thicker than water." I didn't get up. I didn't offer them water or an apology. I simply sat there, my hands resting on a thick, manila folder that Sarah had delivered an hour prior. "Is it Brianna?" I asked, my voice as calm and chilling as a winter morning. Because when I was bleeding out in a Chicago intersection, blood seemed pretty thin. It seemed like it was already on a first-class flight to Rome. "You didn't stay because you didn't want to hover, remember? You wanted to unplug." "Well, I just helped you finish the job." Thomas stepped forward, his face reddening with the same toxic entitlement that had fueled his life. "Enough of this drama, Maya. You had your little tantrum, and we all suffered for it. Now, you're going to reimburse us for the stress, the emergency flights we had to book on a high-interest credit card, and the humiliation. You will reactivate the accounts today, or I will make sure everyone in this city knows what kind of cold-hearted daughter you really are." "I'm not reactivating anything, Thomas," I said, sliding the manila folder across the polished wood toward him. "In fact, I'm revoking your status as my father." "Open it." Thomas frowned, flipping the folder open. I watched the color drain from his face in a spectacular, silent wave. His eyes darted across the forensic audit, the IP logs, and the side-by-side comparisons of my real signature versus his clumsy forgeries. The silence in the room became heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on all of them. "That's a police report waiting to be filed," I said, my voice dropping to a low lethal register. "Forgery. Identity theft. Grand larceny. $40,000 is a lot of years in a state penitentiary, Dad. You talk about blood loyalty like it's a shield you can use to hide your greed. But here's the reality. Loyalty is a contract of mutual care, and you breached it the second you started stealing my future to fund your failures. You have 2 choices. You can sign over the deed to the family cabin in Michigan to me today, the one I've been paying the taxes on for 5 years, or Sarah calls the district attorney in exactly 5 minutes. Choose your next move carefully. You can have your pride, or you can have your freedom. You don't get both. Thomas looked at Jennifer, then at the folder. The architecture of his lies had finally collapsed, and he was standing in the rubble. He reached for the pen Sarah had provided. As he signed the transfer, I felt the last of the weight lift. I wasn't just an architect of buildings anymore. I was the architect of my own liberation. The family cabin in Michigan was sold 48 hours later. I didn't want the memories. I wanted the equity. With the $40,000 recovered and the profit from the sale, I booked a flight. Not to Rome, but to a small village in the Swiss Alps where no one knew my name. As I stood on the balcony of my new life, watching the sun rise over the jagged peaks, I realized that some structures are meant to fall so that something stronger can be built in their place.